Holbrook 90.3.
And WEVQ Littleton 91.9.
And online at nhpr.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Peter Biello, and this is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on The Exchange. The two major party candidates in the race for New Hampshire's 1st congressional district respectfully disagree in their first debate. Residents gather for a meeting on the controversial Seacoast Reliability Project, and 2 more bears are shot and killed after officials worried they could cause major traffic problems. Listeners, you can call into the Exchange at 1-800-892-6477. That's 1-800-892-NHPR. You can also send an email to exchange@nhpr.org or post on our Facebook page at NHPR Exchange. That's all one word there. And we are also streaming a live video of this radio show, so it is very easy to listen and watch. Check out the stream at our Facebook page, NHPR Exchange. And here to talk about the week's news and answer your questions are Dean Spiliotis, Civic Scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU, NHPR's Lauren Chulgen, and Kevin Landrigan of the Union Leader. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Peter.
So again, listeners, the number for you to call to join the conversation, 1-800-892-6477. We're going to start today talking about the debate between Democrat Chris Pappas and Republican Eddie Edwards. So give us a call now if you'd like to weigh in on how they did. 1-800-892-6477. So those two major party candidates met at NHPR this week to talk about where they stand on the issues ahead of the midterms, less than a month away. One issue that came to the fore was Social Security. We'll start there. Edwards said that it would be wise to, quote, wean people off Social Security, and Democrats later pounced on that. Lauren, what exactly was Edwards saying about Social Security?
Yeah, so actually, because this has now become like the topic of the week between two campaigns, we have the tape of that so we can hear the full exchange. So let's listen to that.
Yep.
When government makes promises, it has to fulfill those promises. Seniors should not be threatened or concerned about their senior years when they're there to enjoy their life. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we stabilize Social Security. But moving forward, we have to look at the way to start weaning people off Social Security as well in the future. But right now, we have to secure Social Security because we made a promise to our seniors, so we have to stand up and live up to that promise.
So you said weaning people off Social Security? Is that what you said? Or?
I'm talking about the future generations. I believe that people should have more control over their own lives. But right now, the Social Security program, as we understand it, we have to secure that program so to make sure the seniors are taken care of as we promised.
So I think what it sounds like he's saying is, yes, he did say wean people off Social Security. I think he was trying to make a distinction between maybe in the future looking at that program differently. But regardless, he did say wean people off Social Security. And so the Pappas campaign jumped on that so quickly, made a digital ad. They've been like blowing up our inboxes ever since. And then later, the Edwards campaign came back and said that it's a smear campaign from the Pappas campaign. And so it was, you and I talked about this yesterday, Peter, that the Landrigan headline of the day was that they respectfully disagreed. And they did. They're two very nice guys. They were very respectful in their disagreements. But I'm wondering if now we've kind of taken a turn and that the heat is on and that maybe in the next debate we will see a little bit more fire between the two of them.
Kevin?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lauren. And, of course, the next debate this coming Thursday will be before the AARP. So you can be sure Social Security will be right back on the front burner. It's not an issue that Edwards talked a lot about during the primary. It didn't really come up a lot. It's the problem that conservative Republicans have with this discussion about privatization of Social Security in the future, in other words, giving younger workers the ability to have freedom to craft their own retirement income sources, is they don't have a president echoing this. I mean, George W. Bush back in 2000 is the last president to try and put his toe in the water and try and make this issue work. Incidentally, it was hurtful to Republican members of Congress and candidates for Congress in the midterm in 2002. And I think Edwards is going to find the same problem now.
There's an old saying in American politics that Social Security reform is the third rail of American electoral politics. And you mentioned George W. Bush. After he was reelected in 2004, reporters asked him how he was going to expend his political capital from being reelected, and he said Social Security reform, and it basically went nowhere. I think Pappas in the debate said it's a foundational program. Mm-hmm. For now, that's the reality. It was interesting. You could kind of get their differing perspectives on the issue of the Social Security cap, raising the cap on taxes that you contribute for Social Security. Pappas, I think, said he supported possibly raising the cap. Edwards really said it had this interesting phrase that that increasing taxes is almost a form of punishment, and so there's some stark differences there on that program, but also more broadly the role of government in providing services or a social safety net or what have you. I mean, Edwards spelled out a very conservative notion of the role of government in society. Now, we are a libertarian state, but that also is a swing district, and it left me wondering, beyond sort of a kind of a values appeal, how he's going to try to win over some of those independent voters that he'll need to win that district, given how conservative he was in the agenda that he laid out.
Yeah, Lauren, I was curious, were there any issues or points that these candidates made that kind of strayed from their party's line?
The party line, I don't know. I mean, it's such a weird time with party politics right now, where I think that both parties are kind of in an existential crisis, so to speak. So I think, if you're a Democrat, but you're a more left-leaning Democrat, you kind of want Chris Pappas to be more progressive on health care, so to speak. You want him to say, I'm all for Medicare for all. But that's not him. He says universal health care, which is kind of like a straddling of the two. But I think, to me, where we saw, I guess, a partisan split or something that highlighted kind of like the divisiveness in our country right now is the way they talked about the quote-unquote historic nature of if either of them win. I was really struck by the way that both of them talked about, if Edwards would be elected, he would be the first black congressman from New Hampshire. If Chris Pappas was elected, he'd be the first openly gay congressperson from New Hampshire. And so, that's something that's like the go-to headline for national stories about this race. And yet neither of them really seem to care that much about it, especially Edwards. So first, let's start. I have some tape of this. First, when I asked him outright, Eddie Edwards, has this kind of resonated for you at all? And he said no.
I think the notion that we start to believe that we're special because of our sexual orientation, our race, our gender, we do a disservice to everyone in this country. You're not special. I'm not special because I'm black. Chris is not special because he's gay. You're not special because you're a woman. We're special because of what we give back to our communities, our nation, and our families. That's what defines us. That's what makes us special. The fact that we go down this road of identity politics and we constantly try to divide us up into categories and believing that we have to protect one group of Americans over another while demonizing one group over another or promoting one group over another. I think it's time we get back to respecting all Americans.
So, my question was not in an attempt to be divisive in any way. I can say that. I think I was just trying to get at this larger point that we're in this moment right now where both of you would have this historic title. What do you think about it? And then we move into this conversation of all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter from Edwards. And then on the flip side, from Pappas, we hear, when I ask him the same question, that, would this be meaningful to you? Here's what he said.
It's not meaningful to me, but I truly believe that we're all in this together, and that by telling your own story, you can ensure that other people are accepted in their communities and can live their truth and pursue a healthy and successful life. And I think that's what it's about at the end of the day, about making sure that communities that feel marginalized are brought into mainstream society and are able to participate in our democracy and are able to succeed in our economy. And I think there are still individuals in our state who are feeling marginalized. So if there's a member of the LGBT community out there who's questioning their place in our state, maybe this sends a really strong positive message to them.
So then this ended up being an answer about, visibility of diverse candidates. So I thought that was a really fascinating exchange.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me. When the question was posed, from what I've heard from Edwards before, I expected him to answer it exactly as he did. That he would say that it didn't matter to him, and he would make a broader point about special interest. And I do think it boxed Chris Pappas in a little bit. I don't think Pappas, in a different set of circumstances, would have said it doesn't matter to him personally, and he did come back around at the end to his more typical answer about marginalized groups in society. So this is really interesting distinction. And Lauren, maybe you might want to talk a little bit about this. There was this interesting set of exchanges about President Trump and whether or not what he says is racist, and then also on the abortion issue. And Edwards' answer seemed to be that by simply raising those questions,
yes,
that was
I'm being
divisive, which just struck me as a little odd. So how do you talk about these issues if just raising them is being unfairly divisive?
Well, that was really interesting to me too, Dean, because it was, that was how he framed it, was that by me asking the question that it was a divisive, I'm being divisive. And it's just so interesting to me because this is where we are right now. And in my, mind as a reporter, I'm more asking the question well, this is the president, this is his behavior.
You have to be able to talk about
and
that
you
stuff.
support him, what is your response? But then at the end he said, Republican or Democrat, bullying behavior is bullying behavior, and he doesn't support that. So it's kind of like a little bit of both. And I think, I don't want to speak for Eddie Edwards, but I think both of them are in this place right now where, as you said, they're going for that middle. That independent voter is really important to winning the district. And so there is a balance that both of them do have to strike, and they both know that. And they both, are trying to be, picking up those base supporters. There are a lot of people in the state who love President Trump, who really believe in his vision for the country, and Eddie Edwards needs those people. But there are also a lot of people who, maybe they're conservative, maybe they're independent, but they're not really happy with the president. And so they're not really paying super, super close attention to all local issues or all policy issues. And so they are looking for someone who is kind of on their level about their feeling about the president. So that's why this race to me is super fascinating.
Yeah, but when favorability of Trump among independents in New Hampshire is about 30% in the state, it's not a good look for Edwards to be hugging Trump. Edwards is hugging Trump for one reason, and it's financial. He's desperately trying to get the National Republican Party to pay attention to this race. And it's really hard as Republicans nationally in the U.S. House are playing defense all over the country, trying to hold on to seats that even in a typical midterm election, they wouldn't have to worry about. Already, the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee has said to some Republican House incumbents, your history, you're basically dead to us. You're on your own. We don't think you're going to win re-election. So Edwards is trying to get the attention nationally of folks to this race. And it's an interesting play for him, and I think it's an important one because financially he needs to get a large investment of support in these waning weeks. It's clear the national Democratic establishment is going to get Pappas the money he needs. It's not as clear as to where Edwards gets the closing money he needs.
And so the next thing we have to look for is their forum with the AARP, was it, next week?
Yeah, and then they're going to have 5 debates total between the two of them. And, like I said to you yesterday, it's 2018, so anything could happen in the next couple of weeks that changes the dynamic of the race or could add some sort of support on one side or the other. Both sides are trying to get voters out to the polls like they would in any election, but they're really trying to tap into some of these national themes that we've talked about. The Democrats are doing, nonstop phone calls with women candidates or women volunteers to really bring people back to that really emotional moment of the Kavanaugh hearings. That's their focus. Then we've got Chris Christie coming into town before the election, trying to fire up the more Trump base supporters. So I think it really remains to be seen. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't know that if yesterday really moved the needle at all for people who, it's still so new for people to see both of them together. I don't know that anyone was watching that debate oh yeah, I was undeclared and now I know. But in the next 4, maybe, I think we could start to see more.
And they painted such starkly oppositional views of the role of the government. It's kind of the private decisions about abortion or right to bear arms. I mean, Edwards is essentially unrestricted gun rights, as best I could tell. So, in terms of moving the needle, there wasn't a lot of overlap there where you were saying kind of one or the other. You sort of know where you are in terms of the two very different ideological positions painted by both candidates. 4 or 5 debates. By the 4th or 5th debate, they're going to know each other's responses. They're probably going to kind of be tired of dealing with each other, and it'll be interesting to see if that has any kind of effect in terms of letting us see what their temperament is under pressure.
Yeah, last thing on this debate, one issue that did make some news we haven't talked about yet was their discussion of climate change. And Eddie Edwards made some comments about the relationship between climate change and human behavior that I think was shocking to a lot of people because it was at odds with the scientific consensus.
Yeah, so I asked him, do you believe that there's a human factor here in climate change? And he said no. And he went on to have an answer about, in dealing with environmental issues, he doesn't want there to be a lot of involvement from the federal government. This is a local issue, which is what Dean was talking about earlier. And yeah, I think that this raised some eyebrows because there's a lot of science that backs up climate change and human involvement in that.
And this week there was the big UN report.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course. But I opened the question up that way because we haven't really gotten a chance to hear from him on climate change very much, and I wasn't 100% sure that was going to be his answer. And so I think the next follow-up questions in the following debates will inevitably be, okay, well, there's this research that suggests this. How do you square, or do you think that science should be involved in creating federal policy about climate change? So those are, I think. It's a fun place to be the first debate, right? Because then you start all these issues and you get to follow up for the next couple of weeks.
All right. So more debates to come. We'll cover them when they come up. Listeners, give us a call if you have questions about the week's news. The number is 1-800-892-6477. You can also send us an email. The address is exchange@nhpr.org. Let's talk about the state Senate. Currently 14-10 Republicans, Democrats. But Democrats are hoping to gain a few seats, and apparently the GOP is playing some defense here. The GOP sent out some mailers attacking Democrats in 8 races. Kevin, what do you make of this?
Well, it's sort of pretty predictable, meaning that with a narrow Republican majority, if they lose 3 seats, obviously in November, the Democrats take control. They're really concerned about holding on to the seats they now have. Republicans in the state Senate, one of the advantages they have this time that they often don't have is there's nobody leaving. So all of their incumbents are running for re-election. So that's a good place to be. But a little over a month ago, I believe it was, the Senate Republican PAC made a contribution to the Republican Party. I think it was around $50,000. Now we know what it was for. I mean, they essentially are asking the state party to do their bidding with these mailers and have identified these 8 seats, obviously, as places where they think there are potential for Democrats to do well. And I think I do think that it's not likely for Democrats to run the table and win 8 of those seats. And one of the reasons is redistricting in the state Senate. There are 24 seats in the state Senate, and they're not all competitive for both parties. There are 8 or 9 really solidly Democratic seats in the state Senate, and there are 11 or 12 really solid Republican seats in the state Senate. So you often are fighting over those 3 or 4 that are left, and the Republicans, obviously, with this mailing, are trying to shore up some of their other seats as well.
Yeah, and you're right. In the recent electoral cycles, we're typically talking about 1 or 2 seats, a couple seats moving either way. You just don't see the big swings anymore the way you might with the House of Representatives. And it's just interesting to me more generally the extent to which these state Senate races, also executive councilor races, have increasingly become sort of pretty high profile, larger money than they once were in terms of investment, because a lot of people see it as kind of a stepping stone to a maybe higher office at some point, or just more integral to what's going on in the state in terms of policy. But I've just noticed over the years, increasingly, these races, more money, more outside money. It's part of what's going on around the country in terms of the nationalization of politics. It's groups getting involved for all sorts of different reasons.
Okay. Final thing to discuss before the break is that former New Hampshire Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte was in the news because at an event this week, Republican State Senator Jeb Bradley expressed support for her running again in the Senate in 2020, challenging Senator Jeanne Shaheen if Shaheen decides to run again. So I guess never too soon to look at a Senate race, Kevin?
No, it isn't. And Republicans certainly, that's the next big race. We're in this interesting, midterm with other U.S. Senate race. There's always a different feel in the politics in New Hampshire without a U.S. Senate race. It's a little less high charge. There's certainly less big money. We're going to have that in 2020 with the presidential race. And Jeanne Shaheen up for re-election. Should she decide to run? She hasn't said she will run for a third term. But Republicans certainly think Ayotte would be the strongest contender. It's interesting. Since she lost in 2016, it seems like every couple of months Kelly Ayotte still stays in the news, right? I mean, she obviously was involved in the U.S. Senate nomination for Neil Gorsuch and helped bring that over the finish line. She's been rumored to be everyone from the next Attorney General if Jeff Sessions gets sacked to the UN ambassador this past week. Her name has popped up as well with Nikki Haley announcing that she's leaving. We certainly anticipate Ayotte's going to be involved.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense among national Republicans that she was a rising star. The loss caught everybody by surprise, and they want to kind of get her back on that trajectory. They don't feel like her political capital is completely diminished at this point. And, you think about Jeanne Shaheen's seat, right? She lost to Sununu and then came back and took the seat. So it's not unusual for somebody to come back in and take or even Carol Shea Porter in and out. So you never know.
All right. Well, this is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I want to thank NHPR's Lauren Chulgin for joining us this part of the show. Thanks, Lauren. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Listeners, coming up, a group of New Hampshire legislators and renewable energy advocates issued their response to the governor's 10-year energy strategy. NHPR's Annie Ropeek will join us after the break for that conversation. But you can give us a call now and tell us what you think. What do you think of the governor's 10-year plan or this new response to it? The number is 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org or post on our Facebook page at NHPR Exchange, which is where you can watch a live video of this radio program. This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup. I'm Peter Biello. We'll be right back.
It's 9:19. You're listening to The Exchange on NHPR. NPR's popular current affairs program 1A is coming to New Hampshire this month. Host Joshua Johnson will moderate a special panel event. Don't miss your chance to see Johnson in person, as well as NHPR's Peter Biello at the Capitol Center for the Arts in Concord on October 18th. Tickets at ccanh.com. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Massachusetts General Hospital, using research to develop treatments for complex conditions, all to help their patients get back to their lives. Mass General, revolutionizing care. And New England College, proud to host the Henniker Race Series 10K Trail Race on Saturday, October 20th. All proceeds go to charity. Learn more at nec.edu/community. And Concord Food Co-op with a reminder that shopping at the co-op for healthy, locally sourced products is like a vote to support local farmers, and membership is not required. ConcordFoodCoop.coop.
This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello, here in the studio with Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU and author of the website NH Political Capital, Kevin Landrigan of the Union Leader, and joining us for this part of the show is NHPR's Annie Ropeek. Hey, Annie.
Hi, Peter.
So, listeners, give us a call if you have questions or comments about the week's news. We're going to be talking about the Seacoast Reliability Project in just a little bit, so please do call now about that to get in the queue. We'd love to bring your voice into the conversation. What do you think of the project? 1-800-892-6477. But first, we're going to talk about the response to the governor's 10-year energy strategy, because, Annie, you reported on this week the group of New Hampshire legislators and renewable energy advocates. They issued this response to the governor's plan. And before we get to their response, can you tell us briefly about what the governor's 10-year plan was?
Yeah, so this came out in April. It's the governor's 10-year energy strategy for the state. It basically calls for an all-of-the-above energy strategy that puts rates first. That's kind of the tagline. And so this is about fewer subsidies and incentives for renewables. It's about allowing renewables to compete on what they describe as a level playing field with fossil fuels. It also says, if the state wants to meet rising demand and keep costs down, it's going to need more pipelines and infrastructure. We're going to need to keep Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant open. also that we shouldn't be sort of picking favorites among energy sources. And so a lot of renewable energy advocates saw that as kind of a lackluster support for their side of things.
Mm-hmm. And so to bring their side up to the forefront, they've issued this response.
Yeah, that's right. So many months later, they've been working on this, they say, all on a volunteer basis, kind of on their own time. It does show in the paper. It seems like a very sort of homegrown type of thing, which is always interesting to see. So this was most of the House Democrats that are on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. And then it was some advocates from like the solar industry, hydro. A lobbyist for Liberty Utilities actually wrote the section about transportation, although Liberty says they do not have an official position on this plan, which is not friendly to natural gas. And this plan is a big a roadmap to big renewable energy development. It says that there are realistic steps the state could take, sort of quick and big, but realistic steps to seeing 100% of our electricity powered by renewable sources by 2040.
Mm-hmm. And does it actually spell out all those steps?
It does, yeah. I mean, each of the advocates wrote a little section. They pulled a ton of data from the state. They did a lot of the legwork that I've been meaning to do for a long time.
And for listeners who can't see, so there's this binder that Annie has in front of her, and by the looks of just flipping through it, there's a lot of small font, single-space text in there, so it seems pretty detailed.
They have a lot of charts. Yeah. There's a lot of appendices.
Okay.
And so they really say, if we worked hard and looked at this really seriously and had detailed policies that support renewable energy, we could make this happen. And they say there's environmental and economic reasons to want to do that.
So it would take some cooperation on the part of the legislature to make at least some of these happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I asked some of the legislators who were there what kind of bills they plan to bring next session to support this plan. They say they want to try to revive net metering, which is where customers who have solar panels on their house or business can sort of sell that power back to the grid at the market rate. And that bill was vetoed by the governor, narrowly not overturned by the legislature amid the whole biomass fight. Mm-hmm. Biomass is part of this plan, incidentally, which is not something all environmentalists are going to love. And so is hydropower, another thing that is not universally popular among the renewable energy set. But it's sort of the renewable energy version of an all of the above approach. And it says we want to wean off fossil fuels ASAP. They're going to propose carbon pricing schemes in the legislature next year. Want to support the federal effort to do that, and they hope that the recent UN climate report that was so dire and has really cast a pall over a lot of environmental discussions this week. They hope that might sway some Republicans to their cause. They hope there will be more Democrats in the legislature next year who will vote for these bills, and they hope they might be able to find some compromise with the Sununu administration, though remains to be seen if the other side is willing on that front as well.
And one of the representatives sort of leading the charge on this is Representative Lee Oxenham, who says the state should not wait to start tackling climate change.
We all know the bad news. This document shows us a path forward with good news. We know the causes and we have the solutions, both in terms of policies and technologies.
So, Dean, what do you make of all this?
This is fascinating to me. I think in part it's because we've had Democratic governors for most of the last 20 years. We haven't really, as a state, experienced the kind of whiplash that you often see in environmental policy when you have frequent changes between Republican ideology and Democratic ideology. And so for the first time in a while, we're experiencing kind of the sort of the ping pong of the renewables versus other types of sources. The Trump administration and, Trump has been very high profile about focusing on coal. Not that we're going to have a lot of coal here, but just this idea of more traditional sources or at a minimum increasing pipeline infrastructure. But we've seen in practice how difficult it is on both sides. Getting the wind project up and running in Antrim took almost a decade. On the other hand, these pipelines have increasingly just run into tremendous local opposition in different communities, regardless of what part of the state we're talking about. So it's a very difficult issue. It's typically not one that is at the top of most voters' lists, although there are people who are issue voters for whom this is incredibly important. And so you often see in a lot of states where you have more swing between parties, policy kind of going back and forth between, well, we're going to go all renewables, and then no, we're going to focus more on prices, even if that means more traditional sources. And so that's where we are now. And I think we haven't had this debate in a while here in the state because it's been a long time since we've had a Republican governor who wanted to move in a little different direction. And when Benson was governor, that was a long time ago now. The technology was at a different place.
Eddie?
I do have the sense that the sides here are kind of talking past each other, which is frustrating to hear, that these Democrats come out with this plan several months after the governor's plan. There was the president of the New England Ratepayers Association, Mark Brown, was kind of sitting there doing some opposition research during this press conference, and I talked to him afterwards, and, he basically repeated the governor's lines to me about how any even short-term increases to rates, even small increases, will hurt poor people. It'll hurt the elderly, and especially businesses. I think that's really a main focus for the Sununu administration and for supporters like the Ratepayers Association. When I asked him if they see any urgency in addressing climate change that can be done through energy policy, he said their organization doesn't consider climate change in its approach, which surprised me. And I think that you're going to see some of that tension start to come through this year, potentially, that for a lot of Democrats, the things are inextricable now, and maybe we'll see that fight play out in the legislature.
Okay. Listeners, give us a call if you have questions or comments about the week's news, 1-800-892-6477. I want to ask you, Annie, about the Seacoast Reliability Project, because last night about 150 people showed up for a meeting on this project, which is supposed to make electricity service more reliable on the seacoast. Very good name for the project, apparently. So, Annie, what was the purpose of last night's meeting?
Yeah, so this was a public site evaluation committee hearing. It's part of their process as they take testimony and deliberate on big energy developments in the state. So the last big SEC battle we saw play out, obviously, was Northern Pass. We all know that ended poorly for Eversource. And so now they're back with this is a much smaller project. It's also been in the works for years. It's a 13-mile transmission line that would be between Madbury and Portsmouth. And it's part of Eversource's response to what the region's grid operator, ISO New England, has called for in terms of more reliable infrastructure, redundant lines, higher voltage backup lines, and that kind of thing, especially in a growing region like the Seacoast. And so this is not a elective project the way Northern Pass was.
ISO says you need to do this
You need
somehow.
to do something,
Yeah.
exactly. And this has been the chosen solution. And so the last hurdle is the SEC, and they're deliberating on it now. So they were taking feedback from residents who were not sort of official interveners in the process.
Okay, and what was that feedback?
Well, so we heard a lot of residents from Durham and Newington, which is where the line would dip under Little Bay for a mile at those 2 points. These people are worried that tall transmission towers would destroy the rural character of their town. And they don't want easements in their backyards being used and sort of destroying the natural setting that they live in. They're worried Newington especially has already seen a ton of development in terms of Pease and the Spalding Turnpike, and they are fed up with that. And then, moreover, there's an environmental argument, especially about Little Bay, that the methods Eversource proposes using to drill the line underneath the bay would stir up so much sediment that, the bay is already in a really fragile state, and that would degrade it even further. So basically, residents want to see Eversource pick another route that would be more expensive, or do some other, bury the whole line, for example, which Eversource says would cost 10 times as much as the current proposal.
More parallels to Northern Pass here.
Exactly. And all of those costs get passed on to ratepayers. Yeah. Let's not forget. Across New England, most likely, but still. So that's kind of the tension we're seeing.
So describe the emotional tenor of the meeting last night.
Yeah, I mean, people were, I think, sort of on mission. They were not angry or hysterical. They mostly kept to their 3-minute time slots, which we don't always see happen. And they were delivering impassioned statements in defense of their towns. They were imploring the SEC to hear them. We even heard from Dudley Dudley, who's a former state legislator and executive counselor who helped fight off a proposed oil refinery in Durham Point in the 70s. She's kind of a legend around there, and people were really excited to hear her talk. A lot of applause for folks like her. And it was 3 hours of near solid opposition to the project, if not to building it at all, to the way it's being proposed to be built right now.
Mm-hmm. And so what is the next step?
So the SEC has some more testimony to take from stakeholders over the next few weeks, and then they hope to deliberate on the project in November, and we could see an approval or denial, or more likely a set of conditions for building the project, I would say, by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, did you want to comment on this? You see you nodding along with Annie.
Well, just that it's a real challenge for Eversource because this part of the state is so environmentally sensitive. And folks, there's an ethos over there about resisting big development that goes back generations, frankly. So to try and get this project approved in a cost-effective way is really difficult for them. And I expect whatever decision the FCC has, if it's favorable in any way, this will probably get tied up in the courts.
Yeah, and sort of in the shadow of Northern Pass, too. I mean, Eversource is trying really hard to remind people that this is not a similar project. It is way smaller. It's mandated in a much different way. The cost would be spread out differently. I mean, all of the above. But people still see this as just another encroachment of a corporation on their, land and livelihood and the culture of New Hampshire. And they saw what the SEC did with Northern Pass, and so they're hoping that'll happen again.
This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello. We've been speaking with our guests today about the week's news. Still to come, the Claremont School Board was considering hiring a collection agency to get parents to pay their kids' lunch debt. Thousands of dollars in debt had piled up. When that news got out, the crowdfunding began. But is this the best way to pay for kids to eat at school? What do you think? Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477. You can also post on our Facebook page at NHPR Exchange, which is where we've got a live video of this radio show going on. Annie, I want to ask you about St. Gobain. That was in the news again this week.
Yep.
Environmental officials say that more than 24 areas at St. Gobain are under investigation for possible contamination. The union leader reported on this too, Kevin, so I'd love to get you to weigh in as well. Maybe we'll start with you, Kevin. So put this latest news in context, because it seems like we knew to some extent that there was some kind of contamination happening at St. Gobain. It's been under scrutiny for possible PFAS contamination, and now this. So what makes this news particularly relevant?
Well, what's really troubling for St. Gobain is that these are new areas of potential contamination that have occurred that the state is finding PFOA amounts in, which include stormwater pipes, sanitary sewer pipes, and other discrete spills. We've already known for some time that that St. Gobain has been making attempts to provide water to homes and on private wells that have been contaminated by PFOA. I think this kind of indicates, as Annie has written in a lot of her good reporting over the years, how nebulous the science is about PFOAs, whether there is a lot of disagreement, even in the environmental community, about what's a hazardous amount of PFOAs in the environment. The residents are obviously very worked up in Merrimack and surrounding towns to see new news about more potential contamination. So they're very upset and are asking the state, do you have the power to shut this plant down? And essentially the state has said, no, we don't.
Yeah, the Clark Frizey of the state said residents want the state to file suit and shut down the St. Gobain plant, but the state doesn't have the authority to do that. Let's hear from him.
If you want us to be authorized and allowed to do more, speak to your legislators and give us more authority, more budget, more people. We care about public health, whether people believe it or not.
And people didn't seem to believe that the state didn't have the authority.
Yeah, I mean, I was in the room when he said that, and there was like an audible scoff through the audience. Huh. I mean, the communication, I honestly have to say, between the state and the residents here is completely broken down. It's pretty disheartening to see. I mean, the residents they believe they're being fed lies. I mean, they don't believe anything the state is telling them. They don't understand why everything isn't happening faster. And the state is saying, we're working as fast as we can. We're working within the laws that we have, and that's how it has to be. And that's just not what residents want to hear.
And from your perspective, Annie, someone who's been following this, is what the state is saying credible?
Well, I think they are telling the truth based on the laws and science that are currently in place. And like Kevin was saying, I mean, that stuff is all really up in the air. I mean, we have new laws on PFAS regulation coming into play in New Hampshire all the time. I mean, we're right in the middle of this. It's not quite an emerging contaminant anymore, but we're at the beginning of this story. And so the state is just next week is going to do public technical sessions to write new limits on PFAS in drinking water. Residents can go to those and bring their own research that they want the state to consider. So the state is trying to figure out what to do about this. But I think residents would really like to wake up tomorrow and see the state having shut St. Cobain down, put in a strict new limit on PFAS, and made some sort of reparations here for what has happened. And all of that is just going to take longer than anyone would like it to. And these new contamination sites are part of the ongoing investigation. So this stuff is going to turn up on a kind of a rolling basis here over the next few years. It's going to seem like a new crisis every day, but this is just how this is going to play out.
And is that because the question is, okay, if they find some kind of chemicals, how much of this chemical is okay? And is that not quite clear yet?
It's not quite clear. I mean, the state currently uses an EPA limit that a lot of other research suggests is too high, but we don't have regulations based on those lower suggested limits yet. We may next year, or we might keep it where it is. And that's something residents are really worried about, to see if the state starts to take into account science from even groups like the Centers for Disease Control, who say these chemicals are harmful in much lower levels than the EPA says.
Okay. Well, let's talk about another story you reported this week, Annie. This is a fascinating story. You reported that the state fish and game officials are hoping for a little federal help to help balance the books when it comes to the cost of rescuing distressed or lost hikers. Apparently, it costs the state a lot of money, even though there are programs to get some of these hikers to sort of pay for their own rescue. But the state is still seeing some red ink about this.
Yeah, this is a perennial issue at Fish and Game, but I love fish and game drama. It's a great topic to report on. And, a couple of the Concord Monitor and the UL both had good reporting on this as well. Basically, this is the latest attempt to try to, as you say, balance the books on Fish and Game's chronic deficit on search and rescue funding. And so most of their or about half their rescues are for hikers. Most of those happen in the White Mountains, which are federally managed. And so they are asking the state's congressional delegation to sort of help them set up meetings with federal regulators to ask for reimbursements for rescues that happen on federal land. Completely unclear if this is going to happen. It would be, as far as we can tell, pretty unprecedented. And honestly, Glenn Normando, who I think we might hear from here, doesn't seem too optimistic that it's going to happen. I think he's been burned before.
Yeah, we've got some tape from Fish and Game Executive Director Glenn Normando. He says he has low expectations of getting federal money for this kind of thing.
I doubt they're excited about setting an example whereby, every state, every jurisdiction in the country will be wanting the same.
They being, of course, the federal government, which will look at this and say, well, if we give it to New Hampshire, we're going to have to give it to everybody, and that will be super expensive. Dean?
Yeah, Annie, I'm curious, do you have any idea if the number of rescues has increased in recent years? I've always wondered if digital technology, cell phones, are giving people a false sense of security. Also, you can get on the internet and look up, 10 great hikes in the White Mountains and not really think about what it means to be up above tree line.
Yeah.
And I was always curious if that's part of the issue, is because you often hear in the news, that they contacted officials using a smartphone or a cell phone.
Yeah, I took a wrong turn down Mount Major one time, and you can see me desperately looking at my Google Maps trying to figure out where I am, which does not work. And so I actually don't know the answer to that question, but it's a fascinating question. I think, the rescues seem to be staying pretty constant, if anything. And they have a lot of, one thing Normando told me is that the big costs here come from a small few number of people that he described as idiots. People who really go up Mount Washington at 3 p.m. in October in shorts and are not prepared, and then have to call 911 in the middle of the night. And that happens, but those are the expensive ones, the negligent ones, the ones that the state has to try to get some money back from the hikers for, but that can't always happen.
And the money that it currently gets right now, I thought was interesting to know that it comes from hunting and fishing fees and things like that.
Yeah, little, $1 on your boat license or your hunting and fishing license, on your Hike Safe card if you buy one of those.
Cards,
yeah, that's their sort of fundraising mechanism for this.
About 10 years ago, that was their solution to this
yeah.
problem. Let's have a Hike Safe card, buy a card, it'll pay for everything. And a number of people have purchased those cards, but
which are sort of like insurance. They mean that if you can't be negligent because you bought this card. Basically.
Exactly, and that's helped to a modest degree. But this is really about the legislature and the next governor stepping up and deciding how important is fish and game to New Hampshire's identity, if you will. And I think it's pretty important. And in a lot of states, you see a lot of states with a lot more dedicated funds to support these kind of activities in fish and wildlife than we have here. We've been very reluctant as a state to allow to do that. The legislature has resisted over the years all kinds of fundraising attempts to dedicate more money to fish and game. But I think it's inevitable because, frankly, this is often what happens, which is to say, often at the end of every 2-year budget cycle, the general fund ends up bailing out the fish and game fund because it doesn't have enough money. So fish and game gets money from what's called money not otherwise appropriated, and it's essentially the general fund, and so. Like I said, lawmakers and next governor, I think Norman Doe is trying to say this. There are the suggestion of a room and meals tax, which is obviously a hospitality tax. It's a tax we basically, except for people who eat at restaurants, we kind of offload to tourists that come into the state. Why shouldn't? And it raises $300 million a year. We're not talking about that kind of money. Why not dedicate a small portion of the room and meals tax to support fish and game?
Yeah, Glenn Normando said you would think it wouldn't be too high a bar to give us $100,000 or $200,000 from that tax revenue to make us whole. And it's not that fish and game can't go rescue someone because they don't have the money. They're just going into the red to do it, and that money is coming out of funds that they want to be using for other, what they would consider to be more important activities, conservation work, fisheries research, that kind of stuff, and it's all depleting those funds. And so they would like more consistent appropriations from the legislature instead of these periodic bailouts, and Glenn Normando suggested that would be even more helpful potentially than federal funding.
All right, well, we've got to take a break, but when we come back, let's hear more from Glenn Normando because he comments on the fact that 2 bears were shot and killed this week in New Hampshire because a fish and game official was worried that the bears were going to sort of run out into traffic on Route 3A. Residents, though, are a little bit upset about the way this was done. We'll get into the details for that after the break. This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello. You can call in with your questions or comments about the week's news, 1-800-892-6477, or send an email, exchange@nhpr.org. We'll be right back.
It's 9:39. You're listening to NHPR.
A gift to NHPR through your estate plan is a wonderful legacy to leave for those who will need a trusted source for news. Hi, I'm Sarah Alger, Director of Major and Planned Gifts for NHPR. As NHPR has inspired you to learn more about your state and your world, so too will your legacy gift inspire future generations. Email me at salger@nhpr.org to learn more about including NHPR in your estate plans, or go to nhpr.giveplans.org.
And support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from the New England Tap House Grill in Hooksett, along with Hip Peas Farm, offering farm-to-table dining from their scratch kitchen, plus a large selection of specialty and local beers on tap. And Enfield Shaker Museum, hosting a cider festival on October 14th with a variety of ciders, food trucks, a farmer's market, music, children's activities, and more. shakermuseum.org.
This is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup on the Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello, and we're speaking with our guests today about the week's news. Dean Spiliotis, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences and SNHU, author of the website NH Political Capital, and Kevin Landrigan of the Union Leader. Give us a call now if you have questions or comments about the week's news. The number is 1-800-892-6477. This week, 2 more bears were shot in Manchester. Fish and game officials say the bears were a bit too close to the roads, though some nearby residents weren't happy. They were hoping maybe that the bears could be sort of tranquilized and moved. That's happened in a few other cases. But Kevin, the state is saying that really wasn't possible in this case.
Yeah, this obviously not a great week for Glenn Normando. This is a controversy that obviously the residents there are very upset about. You see on social media, this basically blew up, much like it did a year ago when Governor Sununu responded to a lot of that concern about dealing with a family of bears that were hassling homeowners in Hanover by having the bears physically removed, even after biologists had recommended the the bears be euthanized. In this case, I think really why people are so upset is there wasn't that discussion here. There was not really any debate. There were reported sightings of bears on Monday afternoon, late Monday afternoon, in this neighborhood, and that's what sent the Fish and Game biologist down there Tuesday to check them out. A biologist went in and ended up, like you said, killing both bears, and I think that's what upset residents so much here contrast that with Hanover a year ago. That was a process, Dina remembered, that went on for weeks where these bears were in the neighborhood and they were causing all kinds of problems, going through trash, and the town had already taken some steps and we ended up moving them. This didn't happen here. Boom, one day later, these little bears are dead.
But do you think that's a result of what was seen with Hanover, and they just basically wanted to avoid having this kind of get out of their control by making it a big public issue with the media and TV and all that stuff, and just do it quickly, and there's just no time for debate or losing control of the issue?
Yeah, well, one of the things in the story that I think did not look good for the state was that allegedly the official just, first of all, was in plain clothes, and second of all, just shot the bears, loaded them onto the truck, and then did not want to talk to the residents who were wanting to ask him questions right then, which seems like, you're a state official, you're doing some state business, maybe talk to a resident who has questions about this.
Right, and an unmarked red pickup truck. I mean, it didn't have Fish and Game insignias on it, so that's why residents in the apartment area assumed it was a poacher who had taken those bears until the state Fish and Game confirmed no, it was our folks who did it. And Dee may well be right, as they may have thought. I think the other complication here that we didn't really see in Hanover, obviously, was Fish and Game couldn't find the mother, didn't really know where the mother was. And folks in this field will tell you that once a mother is separated from the cubs, the mother can become very belligerent and aggressive. And once little cubs are without their mother, they can become very unpredictable in their behavior. They're not necessarily violent, but they're not, in other words, they're not schooled by the mother. So they don't know to get away from humans when the mother says, hey, let's book into the woods. So it becomes a more volatile situation that the mother wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Other stories to discuss this week. One of them is that the Claremont School Board was considering using a collection agency to call in enormous amounts of lunch debt. Essentially, some parents hadn't been paying their kids' lunch bill, and some of those bills became quite large. We're talking, what, $32,000 total,
right.
Kevin?
Right. Yes. And obviously, some residents in the community became concerned about having their taxpayers hassled by a collection agency to pay for school lunch money. So private fundraising started to occur on social media. There had already been some money that had been raised after a few days. This is a problem many communities have, and it seems like it is. There is kind of a growing kind of pushback against. From many residents against what the federal government requires when you apply for free and reduced lunch. You have to fill out an application. And it's much more involved than it used to be, that application. And it asks a lot of questions about your financial status.
So you're saying the parents have to fill this out, is what you're...
That's correct. Yep. And so a lot of parents... don't apply and resist that. They consider government snooping into, where I get my money. It's not your business to do that. And school districts are required to essentially provide lunch to students that don't have lunch. So we're talking about in a city like Claremont where already a large percentage of students are already on the free and reduced school lunch program. So they are subsidized. But this debt is obviously a problem, like I say, that a lot of communities.
Yeah, and we're talking about. I think they said that the average family that falls behind may be about $500 to $700 behind in their payments, and over the course of the across the district, that adds up to $32,000. It was unclear from some of the comments from the district officials about sort of that they weren't opposed to the idea of raising money, but they didn't know necessarily that was kind of a long range strategy for dealing with the problem. And it is in Claremont, a number of schools, 50, I think one elementary school, 70% of the kids qualify. So this is a significant issue.
Yeah, and Nick Koloski of I apologize, I can't remember his exact title, whether he's part of the city council or the school board, but he did
city
launch
council.
It was city council,
right.
and okay, so he launched a Facebook fundraiser, set out to raise $500. As of just before the program this morning, it was up to $2,700. So there's some progress being made there, but it's like you said, Dean.
It's not $32,000.
Nor is it a long-term strategy.
No,
exactly.
I think that's the concern. I think that's the concern Claremont has, and frankly, the State Department of Education has. They've been kind of vocal in getting into this and saying all school districts need to deal with a chronic debt in their program and come up with a sustainable way to get rid of that debt. And basically, fundraisers on the internet is not a sustainable way to deal with a chronic underfunding of this program.
Mm-hmm. A few more things to talk about there. They're a little more lighthearted. One of them is that Concord Police have acquired a comfort dog, a 4-month-old lab named Liberty. Kevin, what's Liberty the lab going to be doing on the job?
Yeah, this is different than the police canines that you're familiar with. Obviously are used to help officers get into difficult situations. Also are very good at not only finding offenders in the woods that may be hiding, but also detecting drugs. This comfort dog would essentially help trauma victims in the field or at the police station, as well as provide a source of morale for officers or families that may be facing difficulties. It's believed to be the first of its kind in New Hampshire at all. It's modeled after a community in California that has developed this program. Property taxpayers in the city of Concord will be happy to learn the money to support this at the outset, at least, is not coming out of taxes. It's a nonprofit is donating resources, about $5,000 to get this program up and running.
And it's cute.
Yeah, of course, the lab is adorable and paraded around city council. And how do you say no to liberty?
Yeah, good. Yes, there you go. And how do you say no to liberty? It's as if they planned it that way.
Exactly.
Okay, sad news for Yankees fans here, myself included, I must confess. All eyes were on Yankees and Red Sox this week, but the Yankees just couldn't pull it off. The Sox advanced, now facing the Houston Astros. Kevin, what do you think? What are the Sox prospects? And maybe, Dean, you can weigh in on this too.
Yeah, well, they're playing with house money now if you're the Red Sox. You haven't won a playoff series for 2 years in a row, so to win one is great. And to beat the Yankees, obviously, is even greater. But you're up against the defending champion here, a team that's also won over 100 games, a team that has a better pitching staff. I think we're relying really on the forces greater beyond our control, and the notion that in baseball it's very difficult to repeat, and everything has to go perfectly. And I think the Sox are hoping the stars align, and so they have a much better chance. Because I make Houston the favorite right now.
Houston the favorite. Okay, what do you think, Tim?
It was, yeah, it'll be fun to watch, but it was certainly more exciting when we were waiting for the Sox to just win one a number of years ago. And then, I lived in Chicago for a number of years, and everybody was waiting for the Cubs to win one. So that's sort of a different energy. But it's also competing now. NFL season is underway. Right. Patriots seem to be on track. So there's competition for viewers, but we'll see how they do.
That's what I find really interesting is that how big football is. Yeah. You see even the Boston Bruins have their first home opener this coming weekend. They actually changed the time of the NHL's first game at the TD North Garden because they didn't want to compete with football.
Yeah, and there's some evidence that shows that the ratings for regular NFL games are higher than the baseball playoffs.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Well, Kevin Landrigan of the Union Leader, Dean Spiliotis of SNHU, thank you very much, gentlemen. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having us, Peter.
I want to thank also NHPR's Annie Ropeek for joining us earlier in the show and talking about all things environmental. Really appreciate her perspective. The Exchange is a production of New Hampshire Public Radio. And remember, this conversation continues online on Facebook and at nhpr.org. The engineer is Andrew Perella. Our senior producer is Ellen Grimm. Our producers are Jessica Hunt and Christina Phillips. And our theme music was composed by Bob Lord. I'm Peter Biello. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great weekend.